Picture this: a city under siege, its walls trembling under the relentless hammer of cannon fire, the air thick with smoke, and the cries of those fighting for survival. It's 1283, and Vienna stands as the last bastion between the advancing Ottoman Empire and the heart of Europe. But this isn't just a story about a battle. It's about the moments that define humanity under pressure, the split-second decisions, the acts of unimaginable bravery, and the last stands that became legend. Today, we're diving into 25 of these extraordinary moments during the Siege of Vienna, where ordinary men became heroes, and their defiance changed the course of history. What is it about these last stands that still sends chills down our spines centuries later? Maybe it's the sheer audacity of standing firm when all seems lost, or the way these stories remind us that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the will to fight despite it. From knights clad in steel to farmers wielding whatever they could find, each of these 25 stands is a testament to the unbreakable human spirit. These weren't just soldiers following orders, they were people who chose to hold the line, knowing the cost, and in doing so, they etched their names into history. As we walk through these stories together, you'll witness the desperation, the ingenuity, and the raw determination that turned the tide of one of the most pivotal battles in history. The Siege of Vienna wasn't just a clash of armies, it was a collision of worlds where the fate of continents hung in the balance, and at its heart were those who refused to back down. So join me as we step onto those battle-scarred walls, feel the weight of their choices, and uncover the legends that emerged from the smoke and chaos. This is more than a history lesson. It's a journey into the moments that define what it means to stand against the impossible. To understand the sheer scale of what Vienna faced, we need to step back to that sweltering summer of 1683. The Ottoman Empire was at the height of its power, stretching from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa wasn't just leading an army, he was commanding a force larger than some European nations, with over 100,000 soldiers, engineers, and siege specialists at his disposal. Their goal, to break through Vienna's walls, claim the city as the gateway to Europe, and rewrite the map of the continent. But Vienna wasn't just any city. It was the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, a symbol of Christian Europe, and its fall would have sent shockwaves across every kingdom from Paris to Warsaw. Inside those walls, the defenders were outnumbered nearly 10-1, with fewer than 15,000 soldiers and volunteers scrambling to prepare for the onslaught. The city's fate rested on a fragile alliance of Polish, German, and Austrian forces, all aware that failure meant not just defeat but annihilation. The Ottomans didn't just bring numbers, they brought terror. Their siege towers loomed like shadows against the horizon, their sappers tunneled beneath the walls, and their cannons, some of the largest ever seen, pounded Vienna's defenses day and night. Yet, against this overwhelming force, something extraordinary happened. Ordinary citizens, bakers, blacksmiths, even monks, joined the soldiers on the ramparts. They fought not because they were ordered to, but because they understood what was at stake. This wasn't just a battle for land. It was a fight for survival, for identity, for the future of their world. And that's what makes these last stands so unforgettable. They weren't just military maneuvers, they were acts of defiance by people who refused to let their city die. Every hour they held out, every inch of ground they contested, bought time for the relief force marching toward them. But until that help arrived, Vienna stood alone. The stage was set for desperation, for miracles, and for the kind of courage that turns ordinary men into legends. the first legend of the siege unfolded at the Burg Ravelin, a jagged outpost jutting from Vienna's inner walls like a stone fist. This wasn't just another defensive position, it was the linchpin of the city's survival. When Ottoman sappers detonated their mines beneath its foundations, the explosion tore a gaping hole in the fortress, and waves of janissaries poured through the dust and rubble. What happened next defied all military logic. Instead of retreating to safer ground, a handful of Habsburg soldiers, perhaps no more than 30, locked shields and formed a bristling wall of pikes in the shattered corridor. These weren't elite troops, many were young recruits who'd never seen combat before that brutal summer. Yet as the Ottomans charged, the defenders fought with the precision of veterans, turning the Ravelin's collapsed chambers into a deadly maze. They fired muskets point-blank into the advancing tide, then swung halberds like scythes when gunpowder ran low. One survivor's account describes a grey-bearded sergeant standing atop a pile of rubble, rallying his men even as an arrow pierced his thigh. "Every step they take costs them blood," he roared, and for hours that promise held true. The Ottomans, expecting a swift collapse, found themselves trapped in a nightmare of close-quarters combat. Each room became a battleground, each hallway a choke point where the defenders' sheer stubbornness negated the attackers' numbers. At one critical moment, the Habsburgs even countercharged, driving the janissaries back through the breach in a fleeting moment of defiance. But courage alone couldn't outweigh the inevitable. By nightfall, the last survivors' backs to the inner wall fought atop the bodies of their fallen comrades until the final pike shattered. Yet in their devastating loss lay an unexpected victory. Every minute the Ravelin held forced the Ottomans to divert troops, supplies, and morale into its conquest. The delay bought Vienna's engineers precious time to reinforce the next line of defenses, and word of the stand spread like wildfire through the besieged city. When a relief force finally reached Vienna weeks later, they found the Burg Ravelin's ruins littered with Ottoman dead, a silent testament to how 30 ordinary men had bent the arc of history through sheer refusal to yield. Their names may be lost, but their legacy echoes wherever people speak of sacrifice. While the Burg Ravelin's defenders fought with steel and muscle, another kind of resistance was brewing in the spiritual heart of Vienna. Stephen's Cathedral, the Franciscan monks who'd spent their lives praying within its Gothic arches, now faced an impossible choice: abandon their sanctuary or defend it with weapons they'd never imagined holding. When Ottoman scouts breached the district surrounding the cathedral, these men of peace traded their rosaries for muskets, turning the house of God into an unlikely fortress. The cathedral's towering spires, designed to lift eyes toward heaven, became something far more earthly: sniper nests. Monks who'd once studied scripture now studied the angles of Ottoman troop movements through stained glass windows. Their first volleys were clumsy, their hands shaking not from fear but from the sheer unfamiliarity of violence. Yet with each passing hour, their resolve hardened. One account describes an elderly friar, his voice still echoing with the cadence of daily prayers, directing younger brothers to barricade the nave with overturned pews, creating a killing field where the invaders would have to fight for every step. What made their stand so extraordinary wasn't just their lack of training, it was the symbolism. St. Stephen's wasn't merely a building, it was the soul of Vienna. As word spread that monks were firing from its bell towers, ordinary citizens flocked to join them. A butcher led a group up the spiral staircases with buckets of boiling oil from his shop. Students from the university, barely older than boys, hauled sacks of rubble to drop from the galleries onto attackers below. For 3 days, the cathedral became a microcosm of the siege itself, desperation and devotion intertwining in the shadows of vaulted ceilings. The Ottomans, expecting quick surrender from clergy, instead found themselves battling an enemy that fought with the fervor of those who believed heaven was watching. When Janissaries finally burst through the great wooden doors, they encountered a sight that gave even seasoned warriors pause. Monks standing shoulder to shoulder with civilians, their robes tied back for movement, chanting Latin hymns between volleys of gunfire. The last defenders fell not at the altar, but in the crypt, their final act an attempt to protect the tombs of Vienna's ancestors from desecration. Yet like the Ravelin before it, the monk's sacrifice bought the city something irreplaceable: time. Every hour the Ottomans spent storming St. Stephen's was an hour they couldn't spend attacking weaker sections of the walls. More profoundly, their stand became a rallying cry. Across Vienna, people who'd never held weapons began asking a simple, terrifying question. If men of peace could fight, how could anyone refuse? The line between sacred and profane blurred that week, leaving a legacy far more complex than any battlefield statistic. These weren't soldiers who died that day. They were shepherds who chose to become wolves, proving that even in war, the holiest acts are sometimes the most human. The legend of the Winged Hussars usually conjures images of thundering hooves beneath the sunlit banners of the relief army, but few know about the ones who never made it out of Vienna. Trapped behind enemy lines when the siege began, this detachment of Poland's most feared cavalry found themselves in a nightmare scenario. Cut off from reinforcements, low on supplies, and surrounded by an ocean of Ottoman tents, they faced an impossible choice: wait for starvation or ride straight into the teeth of the enemy. They chose the latter, and what followed became one of the most audacious last stands of the siege. Picture the scene: dawn light creeping over the smoking ruins of Vienna's suburbs, the air thick with the scent of burnt powder and sweat. Then an unearthly sound, the wooden frames of the Hussars' iconic wings rattling like the bones of some great beast waking from slumber. To the Ottomans manning the outer trenches, it must have seemed like specters emerging from the mist. These weren't just cavalrymen, they were living symbols of terror, their feathered wings stretching wide as they leveled lances in a formation so tight it looked like a moving wall of steel. Numbers meant nothing in that charge. Outnumbered 20-1, the Hussars didn't aim to win, they aimed to break. Their lances tore through the first line of Janissaries like parchment, and by the time those shattered, they switched to sabers, hewing a path through the chaos. Ottoman officers screamed orders that went unheard as their ranks dissolved into panic. The Hussars' real weapon wasn't their blades, it was the sheer psychological torment they inflicted. Every wing's rattle, every war cry in a language the Ottomans didn't understand, twisted the assault into something supernatural, but even legends have limits. As the sun climbed higher, the charge slowed horses exhausted, armor dented, wings splintered by arrows. The last survivors fought back to back in a shrinking circle, their once gleaming plumes now matted with dust and blood. Yet in their final moments, they achieved something beyond mere survival. The disruption they caused forced the Ottomans to divert entire regiments to contain them, pulling resources from critical assaults elsewhere on the walls. And when Vienna's defenders peered through the smoke to see distant flashes of winged silhouettes still moving in the enemy camp, it ignited something primal, the unshakable belief that hope, however desperate, could still take the field. Long after the last Hussar fell, their charge lived on in Ottoman accounts as the day the angels descended. It's a fitting epitaph for warriors who turned certain death into a lesson for the ages. Sometimes the most powerful stand isn't about holding ground, it's about choosing how you fall. Vienna's Cantnotter Gate wasn't built for war. It was a bustling entryway where merchants once hawked spices and travelers exchanged news from distant lands. But by September 1683, It had become the fulcrum of the city's survival, defended not by professional soldiers, but by the bourgeoisie, a ragtag militia of shopkeepers, craftsmen, and fathers who'd never held anything deadlier than a carving knife before the siege began. When Ottoman engineers zeroed in on the gate as Vienna's weakest point, these ordinary citizens transformed into something extraordinary. Their stand would prove that courage isn't measured in training or armor, but in the willingness to stand when everything screams at you to run. The first assault came at dawn, Janissaries rushing forward with the confidence of men who'd broken fortified cities before. What they encountered wasn't an orderly military defense, but chaos forged into purpose. The bourgeoisie had spent nights piling cobblestones into makeshift barricades, dismantling entire houses to plug gaps with furniture and rubble. Their weapons were whatever they could scavenge, antique hunting rifles passed down through generations, axes still sticky with wood resin, even the iron rods blacksmiths had been using to shoe horses the week before. One account describes a baker hurling his ovens burning coals onto attackers with a bread paddle, the scent of charring flesh mingling with the aroma of his last batch of rye bread. Wave after wave crashed against the gate, each met with a storm of improvised defiance. When gunpowder ran low, the defenders tore up the cobblestones beneath their feet, dropping them from the battlements like lethal hail. A butcher's apprentice, barely 16, later recounted how he'd fought beside his master using nothing but a meat cleaver and a door ripped from its hinges as a shield. "We didn't know how to retreat," he'd say years later. "Behind us were our homes, our children." The Ottomans, baffled by the ferocity of civilians, adjusted their tactics. Sappers tunneled beneath the gate's foundations, only to find the bourgeoisie had dug their own counter-tunnels, flooding the passages with barrels of rancid oil ignited by torches. When cannon fire finally breached the outer barricade, the Janissaries charged into a nightmare. The gate's archway had been transformed into a killing corridor, its ceiling rigged with hooks suspending shattered pottery, filled with quicklime that rained down blinding dust. But the true horror awaited those who pushed deeper. The militia had barricaded the inner gate with a macabre wall, overturned wagons stacked with the bodies of their own fallen, each corpse propped upright with spears to create the illusion of living defenders. It was a final act of psychological warfare, a message carved in flesh and bone. Even in death, they would not surrender. When the Ottomans finally forced their way through, they found no triumphant cheers among their ranks, only exhausted soldiers staring at the price they'd paid for a single gate. The bourgeois' sacrifice had cost the attackers precious days and countless lives, buying Vienna's engineers time to shore up other sectors. More importantly, it shattered the myth that only trained warriors could shape history. These were men who'd measured their lives in loaves baked and nails hammered, yet in their final moments, they measured it in seconds bought for their city's survival. Their names may not grace monuments like kings or generals, but the lesson they left echoes through the ages. Sometimes the strongest walls aren't made of stone, but of ordinary people who refuse to be ordinary when it matters most. Beneath Vienna's trembling walls, another battle raged, one fought not under open skies, but in claustrophobic darkness, where the air tasted of damp earth and gunpowder. While soldiers clashed above ground, the Habsburg mining corps waged their own war in a labyrinth of tunnels, their picks and shovels as vital as any sword. These were the unseen defenders, men who measured their progress in inches, their victories in seconds bought for the city overhead, and in one collapsing passage, their final act would become a legend whispered in the same breath as the grand cavalry charges and towering last stands. The Ottomans had mastered the art of siege mining, tunneling beneath fortifications to plant explosives that could topple entire sections of wall. Vienna's defenders knew this, and they dug their own countermines, a subterranean chess game where every scrape of a spade could mean death. The air down there was thick with the scent of sweat and fear, lanterns casting flickering shadows on timber supports that groaned under the weight of the world above. Then came the moment when two tunnels collided in the blackness, Habsburg miners stumbling upon an Ottoman sapper team mid-dig. What followed wasn't just a fight, it was a race against annihilation. Outnumbered and outgunned, the Habsburg engineers made a choice that defied instinct. Instead of retreating, they triggered their own explosives early, knowing the blast would bury them alongside their enemies. One survivor's account, scribbled in a letter before he succumbed to his wounds, described the eerie calm in those final moments. The way a young miner hummed a folk song as he lit the fuse, the way the lantern swayed as the ground itself seemed to inhale before the roar. The explosion didn't just collapse the tunnel, it sent shockwaves through the Ottoman sapping efforts, buying Vienna's walls precious days of respite. Above ground, few even knew their names. There were no glorious last charges, no banners to rally behind, just a muffled rumble beneath their feet, a cloud of dust rising from a ventilation shaft, and suddenly, one less threat to the crumbling defenses. But in that darkness, those miners had done something extraordinary. They turned their own graves into a weapon, sacrificing themselves not for a king or a general, but for the simple, devastating idea that sometimes stopping the enemy matters more than surviving them. Centuries later, their story lingers not just for its brutality, but for its intimacy. Unlike the grand stands on the ramparts, this was a battle fought in whispers and trembling earth, where heroism wore the face of soot-streaked men who knew they'd never see the sun again. When Vienna's relief finally arrived, they marched over ground honeycombed with these forgotten tombs, never realizing how much they owed to the ones who'd already fallen, not in the light, but in the dark where history seldom looks. In the shadow of Vienna's grand cathedrals and bustling market squares, the Jewish quarter had long been a place of quiet resilience, a community accustomed to survival. But when the Ottoman tide reached their streets, survival was no longer enough. Facing annihilation, the Jewish residents did something that would rewrite their place in the city's story. They armed themselves with kitchen knives, woodworking tools, and the iron bars of their own gate, forming a militia that had no military training but everything to fight for. The assault on the quarter came at midday, janissaries pouring through narrow alleyways where children had played just weeks before. What they encountered wasn't the easy conquest they'd expected. Barricades of overturned carts and stacked prayer benches turned the streets into a maze of dead ends and ambush points. A rabbi, his prayer shawl still draped over his shoulders, directed young men to position themselves above the archways with buckets of scalding water from the ritual bath. Women smashed roof tiles into jagged fragments to rain down on attackers. This wasn't just defense, it was a reclamation of dignity, a refusal to be passive victims in their own homes. One account tells of a bookseller, his fingers more accustomed to turning parchment than wielding a blade, standing guard over the synagogue's ark with a rusted cavalry saber. When the doors were breached, he fought back to back with a teenage tailor, their makeshift weapons flashing in the candlelight still burning on the menorah. They held the sanctuary for hours, not as soldiers, but as men who understood that some walls are worth dying for, not just the ones of stone, but the ones that hold a people's identity. The Ottomans, frustrated by the unexpected resistance, brought in reinforcements. Yet even as the quarter fell, the delay cost them dearly. Every moment spent battling through those streets was a moment not spent assaulting Vienna's weakening main defenses. And when the smoke cleared, something unexpected lingered in the air. Respect. Habsburg soldiers who'd once crossed the street to avoid Jewish neighbors now spoke in hushed tones of the tailor, who'd stabbed an Ottoman officer with his own sewing scissors, or the elderly woman who dropped an entire shelf of brass candlesticks onto advancing troops. This stand didn't just defend streets, it shattered assumptions. In the years after the siege, Vienna's Jewish community would still face persecution, but never again could they be dismissed as cowards or outsiders. Their courage that day became a quiet rebuttal to every stereotype, a lesson etched in blood and defiance. Heroism wears no single face, and the will to protect one's home transcends faith, language, or creed. The quarter may have fallen, but the echoes of its resistance reverberated far beyond those shattered alleyways, proof that even in the darkest hours, unity can be forged in the unlikeliest of places. The university district should have been easy prey, a cluster of lecture halls and libraries, not fortresses. When Ottoman troops poured into its courtyards, they expected to find terrified scholars hiding behind parchment. What they encountered instead was a barricade of overturned desks, shelves laden with books turned into makeshift ramparts, and a defiant line of students gripping iron candlesticks like clubs. This wasn't just another skirmish, it was a battle for the very idea of civilization, fought with ink-stained hands and the desperate ingenuity of those who refused to let knowledge burn. The professors led not with swords but with strategy. A chemistry lecturer rigged explosive mixtures from laboratory supplies, creating deafening detonations that sent janissaries scrambling. Medical students boiled vats of water laced with caustic powders, pouring them from upper windows onto attackers below. One account describes a philosophy professor, his robe singed, his spectacles cracked, standing atop a pile of law tomes, shouting passages from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics as if the words themselves were armor. "Courage is the first virtue," he bellowed, hurling a flask of phosphorus into the fray, "because it makes all others possible." The students fought with the reckless brilliance of youth. They dismantled astronomical instruments to fashion slingshots, using marble paperweights as ammunition. A group of theology students turned their chapel's silver chalices into molten projectiles, while literature majors braided rope from torn manuscript pages to trip advancing soldiers. The Ottomans, trained to breach castles, found themselves baffled by a defense built from lecture notes and stubborn idealism. Every bookshelf toppled became a new obstacle. Every shattered flask of acid bought another minute for the city beyond. What made their stand extraordinary wasn't just the improvisation, it was the symbolism. These weren't warriors defending land or gold, but the fragile accumulation of centuries of thought. When janissaries finally broke into the great library, they found its defenders standing in a human chain, passing precious volumes hand to hand toward a hidden cellar vault. Even as arrows thudded into the shelves around them, they prioritized saving Euclid's geometry and Galen's medical texts over their own lives. One scribe, mortally wounded, was said to have died with his body curled around an illuminated Talmud, his blood seeping into the parchment like a final annotation. By the time the district fell, the Ottomans had paid a staggering price for every inch of ground, but the real victory lay deeper. The students and scholars had proven that ideas could be as formidable as any army. Their barricades of books, their weapons distilled from curiosity, their refusal to let ignorance win, these became a rallying cry that spread through Vienna's exhausted defenders. Long after the siege, when the university reopened its doors, survivors would point to the gouges in the oak lecterns where blades had struck, the scorch marks on the library stairs, and whisper, "This is where we taught them that knowledge doesn't surrender." The Ottomans took the district that day, but they couldn't take what it stood for: the unbroken chain of learning that no siege could ever truly end. Amid the chaos of Vienna's crumbling defenses, one man transformed the tools of his trade into instruments of defiance. The blacksmith's forge, nestled in a narrow alley near the city's southern wall, had once rung with the steady rhythm of hammer on anvil, a place where horseshoes and hinges took shape under skilled hands. But when Ottoman troops breached the nearby barricades, the smithy became something far darker, a furnace of resistance where molten metal and searing heat became weapons as deadly as any sword. The blacksmith, a bear of a man with arms scarred by decades of sparks, had watched his neighbors flee or fall. Instead of joining the retreat, he stoked his forge to a blistering intensity, pumping the bellows until the coals glowed white-hot. When the first Janissaries stormed the alley, they expected an easy conquest. What they encountered was a nightmare. The smith hurled ladles of liquid bronze across the cobblestones, sending men screaming as their boots fused to the ground. Tongs meant for bending iron clamped around wrists, searing flesh through armor. Even the anvil became a weapon dropped from the forges loft onto soldiers crowding the doorway, its crushing weight amplified by the blacksmith's desperate strength. But his true genius lay in improvisation. With no time to craft proper weapons, he repurposed everything at hand. Nails became caltrops scattered across thresholds. Chains meant for lifting heavy carts swung like flails, their red-hot links leaving grotesque burns. At one point, he even rigged a bellows to blast a cloud of superheated cinders into the faces of advancing troops, turning his workshop into a vision of hell itself. Ottoman accounts later spoke of a demon of fire guarding that alley, his silhouette wreathed in smoke and sparks. What made his stand legendary wasn't just the brutality, it was the symbolism. Here was a craftsman, a creator, forced to wield his life's work as implements of destruction. Every scorched tool, every melted ingot represented a perversion of his purpose. Yet in that perversion lay an extraordinary truth. Creativity could be as lethal as brute force. The blacksmith held his ground for hours, not through martial skill, but through an intimate knowledge of materials and heat, of angles and leverage. The quiet expertise of a trade suddenly turned toward war. When the final assault came, the forge was nearly out of fuel. The blacksmith, his apron blackened and his hands blistered, stood with his back to the anvil, a heavy hammer in each fist. He took at least a dozen men with him before he fell, his last act swinging a smoldering beam across the doorway to slow their advance. His body was found surrounded by twisted metal and the stunned corpses of those who'd underestimated him. But his legacy outlasted the siege. In the years that followed, Vienna's artisans spoke of him in tones reserved for saints, the man who proved that skill and ingenuity could level the battlefield. His forge, rebuilt after the war, became a pilgrimage site for craftsmen who left behind tiny iron tokens in his memory. Even today, the guilds of Vienna preserve an unbroken chain of oral tradition about that day, a reminder that courage wears many faces. Sometimes it's not the sword that turns the tide, but the hand that knows how to shape steel, and when pressed, how to unmake men with it. The Danube River had always been Vienna's lifeline, a shimmering ribbon of trade and travel winding through the heart of Europe. But by September 1683, its waters ran dark with smoke and blood, the Ottoman blockade choking off the city's last supply route. That's when the Danube Flotilla, a ragtag collection of fishing boats, merchant barges, and repurposed pleasure craft, staged one of the most audacious and tragic last stands of the siege. These weren't warships, they were vessels built for hauling grain and ferrying passengers, now crewed by men who knew the odds but pushed forward anyway. Their mission was simple yet impossible. Slip past the Ottoman artillery batteries lining the riverbanks to deliver sacks of flour, barrels of salted fish, and crates of musket balls to the starving city. The first boats made it through under cover of darkness, their oars muffled with cloth, their sails dyed black to blend with the night. But as the siege tightened, the Ottomans strung iron chains across the river and positioned sharpshooters in the ruins of riverside villages. The flotilla's next run turned into a slaughterhouse. Cannon fire tore through wooden hulls, and the Danube's current carried away more than one vessel with every hand still aboard. Yet it was the final voyage that etched their story into legend. Cornered by Ottoman patrol boats near the bend at Nussdorf, the last 5 vessels found themselves trapped, no retreat, no breakthrough possible. That's when the crews made their choice. Rather than surrender their boats to be used against the city, they grabbed axes and began hacking holes in their own decks. Some lit fuses on powder kegs, turning their crafts into floating bombs. One captain, his barge already listing from cannon damage, steered straight for an Ottoman galley, ramming it broadside as flames licked up his mast. Survivors later claimed the river itself seemed to burn that night, the reflections of the dying ships dancing on the water like some macabre festival. What makes their sacrifice so haunting isn't just the act itself, it's the quiet pragmatism behind it. These were fishermen and river traders, men who'd spent their lives reading currents, not battle tactics. They understood better than anyone how desperately Vienna needed those supplies, and how much worse it would be if their vessels joined the enemy fleet. In their final moments, they fought not with swords, but with knots and rigging, sabotaging their own livelihoods to buy the city one less advantage for its foes. The Ottomans, expecting surrender, found themselves battling men who treated their boats like living things, preferring to sink them with their own hands rather than see them turned against their home. When dawn broke, the Danube's surface was littered with debris, shattered masts, waterlogged sacks of grain, the occasional body tangled in the reeds. But the message was clear. Even on water, Vienna would not yield easily. The flotilla's failure to deliver supplies became, in its own way, a different kind of victory, proof that desperation could forge valor in the unlikeliest of hearts. Their names may be lost to history, but their legacy floats on every ripple of that river, a whisper of the day ordinary men chose to drown their future rather than let it fuel the enemy's fire. The night air over Vienna hung heavy with the scent of damp stone and gunpowder, the kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from the held breath of a city waiting for the next blow. The night watchmen knew that silence better than anyone, their lanterns casting frail circles of light along the battlements, their ears tuned to the slightest scrape of a ladder against stone. These weren't soldiers, not in the traditional sense. They were tradesmen and grandfathers, men who'd spent years pacing those walls with nothing more threatening to report than a drunkard's song or a stray dog. But on that moonless night when the Ottomans launched their stealth assault, these ordinary men became Vienna's first and most crucial line of defense. The attack came like a shadow slithering over the walls, janissaries clad in dark cloth, their scimitars blackened to avoid glinting in the starlight. They'd picked the hour before dawn when exhaustion weighed heaviest on the defenders, but they hadn't counted on the watchmen's stubborn vigilance. Old Matthias, the cobbler who joined the watch after his shop burned, spotted the first grappling hook as it bit into the parapet. His shout shattered the stillness, his bell clanging not in orderly alarm, but in a frantic, desperate peal that echoed across the sleeping city. Within moments, every watchman on the northern stretch was ringing, bellowing, even throwing their lanterns down onto the climbers below in a rain of fire. What followed wasn't a battle, it was a sacrifice. The watchmen had halberds, yes, but most had never used them outside of weekly drills. They fought with whatever was at hand. A gatekeeper swung his massive key like a club. A baker's apprentice hurled sacks of flour into attackers' faces to blind them. Their goal wasn't victory, it was time. Every second they held the Ottomans at the wall's edge was a second more for the garrison to rouse from their barracks. One by one, the watchmen fell, but not a single bell stopped ringing until the hand holding it was still. the last survivor, a teenage lamplighter named Leo, was found with his back against the alarm bell's rope, his body pinned to the wood by 3 arrows, yet his weight still kept the bell tolling as the garrison arrived. The Ottomans, thwarted in their surprise, would later call it the night the stones cried out. But Vienna remembered it differently. Those watchmen who'd spent their lives measuring time in the slow ticks of the night had bought the city something priceless, the chance to fight another day. Their names were etched not in marble, but in the quiet gratitude of every soldier who rallied because of their warning, every family who slept on unknowing as the danger was pushed back. It was a reminder that heroism isn't always about strength or skill sometimes. It's simply about standing your ground long enough for others to stand with you. And in the end, that's how the most ordinary hands can hold back the darkest hours. Flour was meant for bread, not battled, but in the desperate hours of Vienna's siege, even the humblest ingredients became weapons. The baker's mill stood near the city's eastern gate, its great wooden gears usually turning to grind grain for the starving populace. When Ottoman troops breached the outer defenses and surged toward the mill, they expected to find panicked civilians. Instead, they walked into a blizzard of white. The baker, a stout man whose hands had shaped dough for 30 years, had emptied his entire stock of flour into the air vents of the mill's grinding mechanism. As the first janissaries forced open the doors, he cranked the gears to life, unleashing a choking cloud that turned the room into a blinding fog. His apprentices, boys who'd never held anything deadlier than a bread knife, swung their rolling pins like maces, targeting the disoriented invaders' knees and wrists with the precision of youths who'd spent years kneading stubborn dough. One account describes the baker himself wielding a long wooden peel, the tool normally used to slide loaves into ovens, hooking it around ankles to trip soldiers into the mill's machinery. The Ottomans, trained to face steel, found themselves battling an enemy armed with the tools of a trade they didn't understand. Every sack of flour thrown into eyes, every scalding vat of water from the proofing room, turned the mill into a nightmare of improvised warfare. What made their stand extraordinary wasn't just the creativity, it was the timing. The baker had calculated the Ottoman advance perfectly, his diversion buying critical minutes for a detachment of Polish Hussars to rally from a neighboring sector. When the cavalry finally crashed into the milling yard, they found the Ottomans still rubbing flour from their eyes, their formation scattered by the baker's guerrilla tactics. The Hussars' charge, usually a thunderous spectacle, was almost anticlimactic in its efficiency thanks to men who'd fought with kitchen tools and a lifetime's knowledge of angles and leverage. The mill itself was beyond saving, its beams shattered by Ottoman axes in the final moments. But as the baker and his bloodied apprentices limped toward the inner city, they carried something more valuable than salvaged grain, the stunned respect of soldiers who'd witnessed ordinary men rewrite the rules of combat. Years later, veterans of the siege would speak of the flour charge with a mix of awe and dark humor, a reminder that courage wears an apron as easily as armor. And though the mill's ovens never baked another loaf, its legacy rose elsewhere in the guild halls where craftsmen began training with their tools as weapons, and in the quiet pride of a city that learned too late how many unsung heroes had walked its streets all along. The Lowellbaste wasn't just another stretch of Vienna's walls. It was the hinge between the city's northern and eastern defenses, a wedge of stone where the fate of entire sectors could pivot. When the Ottoman bombardment cracked its ramparts open like an eggshell, the bastion's commander fell in the first wave, his body lost beneath collapsing masonry. In that moment of chaos, command should have shattered with him. But war has a way of revealing leaders where no one thought to look. A junior officer, barely 25, his uniform still creased from the academy, stepped into the gap with a calm that belied the hell around him. What followed wasn't just a military holding action. It was a masterclass in how ordinary men become extraordinary under fire. His first order wasn't to fight, it was to dig. With Ottoman arrows hissing overhead, he directed survivors to carve firing steps into the rubble, transforming the ruins into a layered killing ground. Every shattered timber became a barricade, every pile of debris a sniper's nest. Discipline held where panic could have ruled. When janissaries poured through the breaches, they met not a routed mob, but a calculated storm of musket fire from angles they couldn't anticipate. The young lieutenant moved along the line like a conductor, his voice never rising above the din, adjusting positions with the precision of someone who'd studied siegecraft not in textbooks, but in the screams of his dying comrades. What made their stand remarkable wasn't just the tactics, it was the psychology. The lieutenant understood something veteran commanders often forget. In the fog of war, clarity is more vital than courage. He assigned each survivor a specific role: reloading, spotting, carrying wounded, so no one had time to dwell on the odds. A cobbler turned. Militiamen later recalled how the officer knelt beside him to demonstrate how to brace a musket against fallen stones for stability, his hands steady despite the blood dripping from his brow. Fear spreads like powder smoke, the lieutenant had muttered, but so does purpose. By nightfall, the bastion was a grotesque sculpture of bodies and broken weapons, its defenders down to a handful of powder-blackened men leaning on their pikes to stay upright. Yet the Ottomans, baffled by the resistance, withdrew to regroup, a delay that allowed Vienna's engineers to reinforce the neighboring Berge bastion under cover of darkness. When reinforcements finally reached the Lowellbaste at dawn, they found the lieutenant slumped against a cannon, his sword notched from hilt to tip, still clutching the torn regimental standard. He'd bought his city 24 irreplaceable hours with nothing but wits and willpower. Historians would later debate whether his actions truly altered the siege's outcome. But for those who fought beside him, the lesson was indelible. Leadership isn't about rank. It's about the moment you choose to become the barrier between chaos and order. The Lowellbaste stones may have crumbled, but the legacy of that day endures wherever people discover that the weight of command isn't carried on the shoulders, but in the quiet decisions that keep others standing when all seems lost. In the choking smoke of Vienna's burning districts, where even seasoned soldiers stumbled through the haze, an unexpected line of defense emerged: children. Not armed with swords or muskets, but with buckets, damp blankets, and an intimate knowledge of every well and alleyway. The city's fire brigade had long trained its youngest citizens in firefighting drills, turning what was once a civic duty into a lifeline when the Ottoman incendiary arrows began to rain. These boys and girls, some barely tall enough to peer over the cobblestones, became the unseen guardians of Vienna's rooftops, their small hands performing a task too dangerous for most adults to contemplate. The first wave of fire arrows struck just after dusk, their flaming tips embedding in thatched roofs and wooden shutters. While soldiers focused on the battlements, the children moved with eerie precision. Teams of 6- and 7-year-olds formed bucket chains from the canals, passing water hand to hand with the efficiency of dockworkers. Older children, their faces smudged with soot, scaled precarious ladders to smother flames with soaked horse blankets, their bodies silhouetted against the inferno like tiny, frantic shadows. One account describes a girl of no more than 10 standing atop a granary, beating back fire with her own scorched apron until the fabric disintegrated in her hands. But the true horror came when the Ottomans adapted their tactics, launching volleys specifically at the brigade's water stations. Children sprinting with buckets became targets, arrows finding their small backs as they strained to douse fires threatening powder stores. The most heartbreaking losses occurred near St. Rupert's Church, where a group of siblings, the eldest 12, the youngest 6, perished together in a collapsed stairwell, their bodies found still clutching the charred remains of a blanket they'd used to shield the church's wooden beams. Their sacrifice wasn't in vain. The delay they brought allowed neighbors to salvage the sacred relics within. What makes their story so gut-wrenching isn't just the tragedy, it's the quiet normalcy that preceded it. These were children who'd spent their lives playing hide and seek in the same streets they now fought to save. A boy who extinguished 3 fires before succumbing to smoke inhalation had been learning his father's craft as a cooper. The girl who organized bucket brigades near the southern gate had sold flowers in the market square every Sunday. Their courage wasn't the stuff of epic poems. It was simple, devastating love for the only home they'd ever known. By the siege's end, Vienna's surviving children bore scars no youngster should carry. Burns on their palms from grasping hot buckets, lungs damaged by smoke, nightmares of arrows cutting through their playmates. Yet their legacy transcended the physical. When the relief forces finally entered the city, hardened soldiers wept at the sight of a child's charred shoe still perched on a rickety ladder, or a tiny handprint smeared in soot across a salvaged wall. These weren't just casualties, they were proof that war spares no one, not even those who should be building snow forts, not barricades, the cruelest irony. Many of these children had trained for fires sparked by accidents, oven embers, overturned candles. None could have imagined their drills would be tested against an enemy weaponizing flames. Yet in their final moments, they fought with the unflinching resolve of those who believe, against all odds, that a single bucket of water can hold back the end of the world. Today, Vienna's fire brigades still honor them in silent tradition. The smallest recruit always carries the lightest bucket, a reminder that courage isn't measured in size, but in the will to stand when the world is burning down around you. Death had become routine for Vienna's gravediggers' shovels scraping against hard earth. The ceaseless rhythm of lowering linen wrapped bodies into trenches that grew longer each day. They worked in silence, their faces streaked with dirt and exhaustion, their hands blistered from digging graves for strangers, neighbors, even their own colleagues who'd collapsed from plague or starvation. But on the 23rd day of the siege, something inside them snapped. When the Ottomans launched yet another assault near the makeshift cemetery, the gravediggers didn't retreat to the shadows as usual. They dropped their shovels, picked up the weapons of the fallen, and charged straight into the teeth of the enemy. Their attack was chaos incarnate, not the disciplined advance of soldiers, but the raw fury of men who'd spent weeks staring into the abyss. Clad in tattered shrouds repurposed as cloaks, their faces still smeared with grave dirt, they must have seemed like vengeful spirits rising from the very pits they'd dug. Witnesses later described the surreal sight of gravediggers swinging pickaxes like halberds, their movements honed by months of breaking unyielding ground. One burly digger, his arms thick from years of wielding a spade, reportedly caved in an Ottoman officer's helmet with a single downward blow, a strike that carried the weight of every anonymous burial he'd performed. What made their revolt so unnerving wasn't just its brutality, it was the symbolism. These were men who'd accepted death as their daily companion, yet in that moment they rejected its inevitability. Their brief, desperate surge carved a wedge through the Ottoman ranks, buying the city's defenders precious minutes to regroup. Some fought with the very tools they'd used to inter others, a poetic twist that wasn't lost on the terrified Janissaries. One account tells of a teenage gravedigger, barely strong enough to lift a musket, loading and firing with mechanical precision, his eyes fixed on some distant point as if he were already measuring the graves this clash would demand. The Ottomans, accustomed to facing soldiers, found themselves battling men who fought with nothing left to lose. The Gravediggers' assault lasted barely an hour before they were overwhelmed, but its impact echoed far longer. Their defiance forced the enemy to question their own momentum. If even those who handled the dead daily could find the will to resist, what did that say about the city's spirit? When the smoke cleared, the surviving diggers returned to their grim work, lifting the bodies of friend and foe alike with the same weary hands that had, for one fleeting moment, traded mourning for vengeance. Their revolt became a dark legend, a reminder that despair can curdle into something far more dangerous, and that sometimes those who know death best are the ones least afraid to stare it down. The Fugger family's palatial home had never been meant for war. Its ornate halls were built for counting coins and hosting merchant princes, not for barricading against janissaries. Yet as Vienna's defenses crumbled, the wealthiest non-noble family in the city made a choice that would rewrite their legacy. They turned their gilded courtyards into killing grounds and their ledgers into kindling for musket molds. What began as a desperate act of self-preservation became something far more profound, a moment where silks and swords collided, proving that gold could buy weapons but not the mercy of war. Servants who'd spent years polishing silver now found themselves melting it down for bullets. The Fuggers' famed accounting books, filled with debts owed by kings and bishops, were torn apart to stuff into gaps in the walls as makeshift insulation against Ottoman cannon fire. Even the family's collection of Renaissance art became ammunition. Marble statues toppled onto attackers, priceless tapestries soaked in oil and set ablaze to block advancing troops. One witness described the surreal sight of a merchant's wife, her brocade gown singed at the hem, calmly directing stable boys to position arquebuses through the gaps in her rose garden's trellis. But the real revolution happened in the courtyard. The Fuggers threw open their storerooms, distributing weapons to anyone willing to fight: street vendors, laundresses, even rival traders who'd once sued them over shipping disputes. Class lines evaporated under the pressure of survival. A banker's son reloaded muskets beside a butcher's apprentice. A silk merchant's daughter applied her embroidery skills to stitching wounds. The family's patriarch, a man who'd built his fortune on interest rates, now bartered bullets for loyalty, offering double pay to any defender who could hit an Ottoman standard-bearer at 200 paces. Their stand lasted 3 days of turning vaults into bunkers and chandeliers into deadly pendulums suspended above stairwells. The Ottomans, expecting plunder, found themselves battling through a labyrinth of wealth weaponized. Every gilded mirror became a sniper's blind, every wine cellar a death trap rigged with shattered glass and flaming brandy. When janissaries finally breached the counting room, they found the old merchant himself standing atop his desk, a pistol in one hand and a ledger in the other, shouting interest calculations like battle cries as he fired. In the end, the Fuggers' fortune couldn't stop cannonballs, but their defiance left an indelible mark on Vienna's social fabric. The survivors who stumbled from that ruined mansion carried a new understanding that crisis doesn't discriminate between rich and poor, only between those who stand and those who crumble. The family's ledgers were lost to fire, but their real accounting came due in the weeks that followed, as the city's elites and laborers alike shared stories of the day merchants fought like kings and proved that even the safest vaults are no match for history's reckoning. The Spanish mercenaries had come to Vienna for gold, not glory. Hired swords from the battlefields of Flanders and Italy, they'd expected another routine garrison contract, a season of drills and tavern brawls before moving on to the next war. But fate and the Ottoman noose tightening around the city had other plans. Stranded without pay or escape, these battle-hardened veterans found themselves staring down an enemy they'd never faced, in a land whose language few of them spoke. What happened next would transform hired blades into legends, their final stand echoing with the guttural war cries of a homeland most would never see again. Their last redoubt was a half-collapsed granary near the Cathedral, its upper floors offering a murderous vantage over the Ottoman approach. Outnumbered and cut off from retreat, the Spaniards did what mercenaries rarely do: they fought without the promise of payment. Forming a tight square in the rubble-strewn courtyard, their pikes bristling like the quills of some cornered beast, they unleashed a volley of insults in rapid-fire Catalan and Castilian that left the advancing Janissaries bewildered. One Ottoman chronicler later wrote of the terror their shouts inspired. These were not the pleas of desperate men, but the laughter of devils who knew death's face by name. What made their defiance so unnerving was its sheer theatricality. These were men who'd turned warfare into performance, each motion polished across a dozen battlefields. A grizzled sergeant from Seville, his breastplate dented from musket balls, staged an impromptu bullfight with his halberd, goading attackers into charges before gutting them with precision turns. Another, a former street performer from Barcelona, juggled 3 grenades before hurling them into an Ottoman assault column with the flair of a carnival act. Even in extremity, they fought with the flamboyant brutality of men who'd learned violence as both trade and art. But beneath the bravado lay something far more profound. As their numbers dwindled, the Spaniards began singing not hymns or patriotic anthems, but the raucous drinking songs of their hometowns. To the Ottomans scaling the walls, it must have sounded like madness, the off-key chorus of dying men bellowing verses about tavern wenches and stolen wine. Yet in those moments, the mercenaries reclaimed something war had stolen: their humanity. They weren't just sellswords anymore. They were sons of Toledo, Valencia, and Granada, defiant to the last. When the granary's upper floor finally collapsed under cannon fire, the handful of survivors fought back to back in the choking dust, their song reduced to a single hoarse voice, a teenage drummer boy from Madrid who kept time on his shattered instrument until an Ottoman scimitar silenced him mid-beat. The mercenaries' bodies were piled with the rest of the dead, their contracts expired in the truest sense, but the legend of their stand endured, a reminder that even those who fight for coin can discover something worth dying for. In Vienna's darkest hour, these strangers had given the city an unexpected gift, proof that courage knows no borders, and that sometimes the loudest echoes come from those with no reason to stay yet who choose to stand anyway. Timekeeping had always been the clockmaker's art, the delicate alignment of gears, the precise tension of springs, the silent dance of mechanisms measuring moments most would never notice. But when the Ottomans breached Vienna's southern district, this quiet craftsman transformed his life's work into something far more lethal. His workshop, once a sanctuary of ticking tranquility, became a masterpiece of destruction, a trap set not with brute force, but with the cold, calculating patience of a man who'd spent decades mastering the rhythm of death. The ruse began simply enough. As Janissaries swept through the neighborhood, they found the clockmaker's door conspicuously ajar, its interior oddly untouched by the chaos outside. The workshop's shelves gleamed with brass chronometers and ornate pocket watches, their polished surfaces reflecting the flickering torchlight. A particularly bold officer, enticed by the prospect of loot, led his men inside, their boots scuffing against sawdust still littered with precision tools. What they couldn't see were the thin wires strung between floorboards, the carefully placed vials of gunpowder nestled behind pendulum casings, or the masterwork at the center of it all, a massive cathedral clock, its hands frozen at the hour of noon. The clockmaker had rewired his entire craft. Every gear, every weight, every chime mechanism had been recalibrated to a single purpose. As the Ottomans rummaged through drawers, one soldier's careless step snagged a hidden trigger. The room exhaled a soft, metallic click. Then, as if the universe itself had drawn breath, silence. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing moved. Then the cathedral clock's bell tolled once, deep and resonant, and the workshop answered. The explosion wasn't the indiscriminate roar of cannon fire. It was precise, almost surgical. Gunpowder-packed clock springs shredded through wood like shrapnel. Gears became shrieking projectiles, and the great clock's weights swung down like pendulums of doom, crushing men beneath their iron might. The blast radius was carefully contained, minimizing collateral damage to neighboring buildings, a final act of consideration from a man who'd spent his life perfecting control. What makes this stand unforgettable isn't just the brutality of its execution, but the poetry of it. The clockmaker hadn't merely fought back, he'd weaponized time itself. His trap didn't rely on strength or numbers. It exploited the enemy's greed and his own intimate understanding of cause and effect. In his final moments, he proved that intellect could be as devastating as any army, and that even something as ordinary as a ticking clock could become an instrument of defiance. When Vienna's survivors sifted through the wreckage days later, they found the clockmaker's body slumped against his workbench, a half-finished timepiece still clutched in his hands. The face was cracked, its hands forever frozen at 11:59, 1 minute before detonation. It was a silent epitaph for a man who chose not just when to live, but exactly when to die. His legacy ticks on in the unspoken lesson he left behind, that in war, as in horology, timing isn't everything, it's the only thing. The stench of blood was nothing new to Vienna's butchers. Their days began with it, their hands permanently stained by it. But when the Ottomans breached the flesh-marked district, the slaughter they found wasn't of livestock, but of men who'd spent a lifetime wielding cleavers and boning knives with surgical precision. What followed wasn't just a battle. It was a grotesque inversion of their craft, as the city's meat cutters turned the tools of their trade into instruments of carnage, proving that skill with a blade knows no boundaries between butcher block and battlefield. They emerged from smoke-choked alleyways not in formation, but in a swarm burly forearms wrapped in chainmail aprons, faces hidden behind blood-spattered masks. Their weapons weren't military issue. Cleavers designed to split ribs now hacked through armor straps. Skewers meant for trussing poultry found gaps in gambesons, and the heavy mallets used to tenderize beef crushed skulls with dreadful efficiency. The Ottomans, trained to face pikes and muskets, recoiled from this nightmare of close-quarters brutality. One Janissary's journal later described the horror of watching a butcher carve through his comrades, like a man jointing a lamb, his knife finding tendons and arteries as if they were marked with chalk. What made their charge so devastating wasn't just violence, it was technique. These were men who could disjoint a hog in under a minute, their muscle memory honed by decades of repetitive motion. A blow meant to sever a haunch from a carcass translated seamlessly into hamstringing a charging enemy. The curved blades used to peel flesh from bone became tools for hooking shields aside before delivering killing strokes. Even their workspace instinct served them. The narrow lanes of the meat market, where they'd spent years maneuvering between hanging sides of beef, became lethal funnels where numbers meant nothing against skill. The butchers fought with a grim pragmatism that unsettled even veteran soldiers. When their cleavers dulled, they switched to meat hooks, dragging opponents off balance before finishing them with work knives. Some wielded the very saws used to split spines, their jagged teeth catching on armor like bread crusts on a serrated blade. The district's cobblestones, already slick with runoff from the slaughterhouses, grew slicker still, forcing the Ottomans to fight not just men, but the very terrain their enemies knew like the backs of their hands. By dusk, the flesh-marked resembled one of their own abattoirs, bodies piled like offal, the air thick with the copper tang of blood and the stench of opened viscera. The butchers paid dearly for their stand. Of the 200 who charged, fewer than 50 staggered back to the inner city. But their sacrifice bought Vienna something irreplaceable: time to reinforce the neighboring Kärntner gate, and a psychological blow that lingered in Ottoman ranks. Years later, survivors would speak in hushed tones of the day the flesh-marked fought back, not as soldiers, but as craftsmen who'd taken a lifetime of mundane skill and weaponized it in defense of home. Their guild hall, rebuilt after the siege, displays no trophies of war, only a simple cleaver on a frayed rope, its edge forever stained. A reminder that sometimes the most terrifying warriors aren't those trained for battle, but those who know the weight of a blade in their hands and the cost of letting it fall. The Abbey of St. Clair had always been a place of quiet refuge, its halls filled with the murmur of prayers and the scent of candle wax, not the groans of dying men. But as Vienna's defenses buckled under the Ottoman assault, the nuns made a choice that defied both canon and convention. While others barricaded themselves behind stone, these women of God flung open their convent doors, transforming cloistered corridors into a secret lifeline for the wounded. Their story isn't one of swords or strategy, but of something far more radical: compassion weaponized against cruelty. Under cover of darkness, they moved like shadows through the ruined districts. Habits stained with soot and blood, they navigated collapsed alleys with the same quiet certainty they'd once used to pace the abbey's garden paths. A novice no older than 16 was said to have dragged a hussar twice her size across 300 paces of open ground by tying his belt to her rosary beads. Others fashioned stretchers from choir robes and broom handles, carrying groaning men past Ottoman patrols with the same reverence they'd once reserved for holy relics. The convent's wine cellar, once stocked with sacramental vintages, became an impromptu hospital where sisters traded psalms for tourniquets. What made their defiance so extraordinary wasn't just the risk, it was the theology behind it. These were women who'd taken vows of enclosure, sworn to separate themselves from the world's violence. Yet when faced with suffering, they reinterpreted their calling with breathtaking audacity. The abbess, a woman in her 60s whose hands trembled with arthritis, reportedly told her sisters, "To turn away from Christ in the wounded is to lock him out of our hearts along with the world." They didn't see themselves as heroes, just brides of Christ doing what brides do, tending the broken body of their groom wherever they found it. The Ottomans discovered their operation on the 8th night. Whether by betrayal or bad luck, Janissaries stormed the abbey at dawn, finding its chapels crowded with injured soldiers propped against pews, their bandages fresh and their foreheads still damp from anointing oil. The nuns made no attempt to flee. Witnesses later claimed they were singing the Te Deum when the blades fell, their voices cutting off mid-syllable like an interrupted hymn. Yet in their silencing came an unexpected resonance. The Ottomans, expecting cowering women, found instead a quiet defiance that unsettled even veteran warriors. One officer, hardened by decades of war, reportedly refused to enter the abbey after the executions, muttering about the stench of too much grace. The sisters' deaths became a rallying cry not just for Vienna's defenders, but for the city's soul. Their story spread through the besieged streets like a whispered gospel, proof that even in hell's midst, some still chose to kneel not in submission, but in service. Today, the ruins of St. Clair's hold no grand monuments, only a simple plaque listing the names of the fallen. But the legacy of those knights lives on in the medical religious orders they inspired, and in the unspoken question they left hanging in history's air: what does it mean to truly conquer when even the gentlest hands can become instruments of rebellion? Their last stand wasn't fought with steel, but with bandages and bravery, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful resistance is simply refusing to let love die first. The Scottish Gate stood as a lonely outpost on Vienna's western wall, its stones scarred by cannon fire and its archway choked with rubble. But on the 22nd day of the siege, an unexpected sound pierced the din of battle. The wail of bagpipes, raw and defiant, slicing through the smoke like a blade. The mercenaries hired from the Highlands had no ties to this city, no reason to fight beyond the coins in their long, empty purses. Yet when the Ottoman tide surged toward their position, these strangers in a foreign land made a choice that would etch their names into legend. They didn't just defend the gate, they turned it into a stage, their music a weapon as unnerving as any claymore. To the Janissaries scrambling up the slopes, the sound must have been incomprehensible. War had its own rhythms, the staccato of muskets, the thunder of cannon. But this was something primal, alien. The Scots, their tartans faded by sun and gunpowder, stood shoulder to shoulder on the broken ramparts, their piper's cheeks bulging as he pumped out a reel that had echoed across Glencoe and Culloden. Each skirl of the pipes seemed to vibrate in the attacker's bones, a sound that bypassed reason and struck straight at the gut. Some Ottomans later claimed the music made their teeth ache. Others swore it summoned visions of mist-choked valleys where no sane man would tread. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was performance as warfare. The Highlanders, vastly outnumbered, fought with the controlled frenzy of men who'd spent lifetimes turning violence into art. A broad-shouldered sergeant from Inverness used his dirk not just to stab, but to hook opponents' scimitars aside like a dancer clearing space for the next step. Another, his face streaked with soot, timed his musket volleys to the piper's beats, creating a lethal rhythm that left gaps in the Ottoman ranks like missing notes in a score. Even their dying was theatrical. One clansman, run through with a spear, allegedly grabbed the shaft and pulled himself closer to sink his teeth into his killer's throat, the bagpipes still shrieking behind him. The piper himself became something more than human. Hit twice by arrows, his plaid dark with blood, he never missed a note. When an Ottoman officer finally cut him down, the man's last act was to roll onto his back, keeping the pipe's bladder inflated with his elbow as his life drained away, ensuring the music outlasted him. The final strains of "The Flowers of the Forest" lingered in the air as the last defenders fell, their bodies forming a grim cordon around their silent piper. But the Ottomans didn't cheer their victory. Survivors spoke of an eerie hush settling over the gate, as if the stones themselves were holding their breath. The Janissaries, usually swift to loot the dead, left the Scots' bodies untouched for hours, some later claiming the dead men's fingers still twitched in time to music only they could hear. The gate's conquest should have been a triumph, yet it felt like trespassing. In the days that followed, a curious thing happened. Vienna's defenders, hearing of the stand, began whistling fragments of Scottish tunes between volleys. The Ottomans, mistaking it for some arcane battle magic, grew jumpy at every unfamiliar sound. The mercenaries had achieved in death what they'd been paid for in life, not just holding ground but haunting the enemy's thoughts. Their true legacy wasn't in the hours they bought, but in the superstitions they planted. Long after the siege, sentries on the western wall would swear that on foggy nights, the ghostly skirl of pipes still rose from the cobblestones, a reminder that some borders can't be taken, only borrowed, and that the right song at the right moment can shake an empire to its core. The apothecary's shop had always smelled of lavender and crushed herbs scented with remedies, not ruin. But as Vienna's streets filled with the groans of the dying and the acrid stench of gunpowder, this healer made a choice that would twist his craft into something darker. When Ottoman looters ransacked his neighborhood, they found his cellar untouched, its shelves lined with barrels of wine and baskets of bread. What they didn't know was that every morsel had been laced with a colorless, tasteless concoction distilled from monkshood and belladonna, a healer's knowledge turned inside out. Silent warfare required patience. The apothecary, a man who'd spent decades measuring tonics drop by drop, understood dosage like poets understand meter. His poison wasn't meant to strike fast, but to linger. The first looters collapsed hours later, their muscles seizing mid-celebration, their feast still clutched in stiffening fingers. Panic spread through the Ottoman ranks as men dropped without wounds, their faces frozen in confusion. Some accused witchcraft, others whispered of divine retribution. The truth was far simpler and far more terrifying. A single apothecary, armed with nothing but a mortar and pestle, had turned his enemies' gluttony against them. What makes his stand chilling isn't just the body count, it's the intimacy of it. These weren't soldiers felled in battle, but men who'd let their guard down, who'd laughed as they cracked open his casks. The apothecary hadn't fought with steel or fire, but with the quiet precision of a man who knew how easily life could be tipped out of balance. His cellar became a laboratory of vengeance, each poisoned barrel meticulously labeled in his neat script as if recording another formula for gout or fever. The Ottomans eventually traced the deaths back to his shop, but by then the damage was done. Dozens of their best scavengers, men who could sniff out hidden grain stores or dismantle barricades, lay twitching in the dirt. The apothecary made no attempt to flee when they came for him. Witnesses claimed he was grinding something at his workbench when the janissaries kicked in the door, his fingers steady even as the blades descended. His final act, smiling not in triumph, but with the grim satisfaction of a man who'd proven that even the gentlest hands could wield death when pressed. His story lingers like a bitter tonic on Vienna's tongue. In a siege defined by cannon fire and cavalry charges, this unassuming man had rewritten the rules of engagement. He reminded the city that war isn't always won with brute strength sometimes. It's the quiet drip of knowledge the invisible killer stirred into a cup. Today, his shop stands rebuilt, its new owners still finding dried herbs tucked between floorboards like ghosts of his defiance. And though no plaque commemorates his act, the lesson remains: beware the healer who runs out of cures. For when the line between remedy and weapon blurs, even the smallest vial can tip the scales of war. In the tangled streets of Vienna's garment district, where bolts of fabric once spilled from shop fronts in riots of color, the tailors made their stand not with swords, but with the tools of their trade. When Ottoman troops stormed their quarter, these men of measuring tapes and thimbles performed an act of transformation so audacious it defied military logic. They dismantled their own worktables, lashing the legs together into crude pikes, then formed a bristling square in the cobbled square where they'd once fitted merchants for doublets. Their weapons were absurd: dressmakers' shears lashed to broom handles, iron yardsticks swung like clubs, even spools of thread unraveled between doorways to trip charging janissaries. But the true genius lay in their armor, layers of quilted silk intended for noblewomen's gowns, stitched hastily into gambesons with the same meticulous backstitches they'd used to hem coronation robes. The Ottomans, expecting to carve through untrained civilians, found themselves facing something far stranger: a wall of men who understood geometry in their bones. Tailors spent their lives calculating seam allowances and pattern cuts. Now they applied that spatial awareness to holding formation. When the first cavalry charge came, their pike square didn't waver. They angled their makeshift spears like they were aligning a master's sleeve pattern, every degree precise, every gap accounted for. A journeyman tailor from Prague, his fingers still calloused from years of pushing needles through brocade, reportedly threaded an iron bodkin through an officer's visor slit with the dexterity of someone fitting a stubborn buttonhole. What made their resistance unforgettable wasn't just its practicality, it was the symbolism. These were artisans who'd built careers rendering beauty from chaos, now doing the opposite. The same hands that could embroider a rose with single hair silk thread now twisted wire into garrots. A master cutter who'd once shaped velvet for archdukes used his shears to sever bridles and reins, sending Ottoman horsemen crashing into their own ranks. Even their failures spoke volumes. When a young apprentice's pike snapped, he allegedly hurled his last weapon, a pincushion studded with rusted needles, into a janissary's face with the accuracy of a man who'd spent years tossing scissors across work tables. By nightfall, the square was a tapestry of carnage-broken pikes jutting like snapped threads, rolls of half-charred fabric still smoldering where they'd been lit as smoke screens. The Tailors' stand had bought Vienna 12 precious hours, delaying the Ottoman advance long enough for sappers to reinforce the neighboring bastion. But their true legacy wasn't measured in time alone. When survivors sifted through the wreckage, they found something haunting. A single unfinished coat, its sleeves basted with white thread, still pinned to a dress form amidst the bodies. The garment was slashed diagonally, not by violence, but by deliberate cuts, as if its maker had cannibalized his own masterpiece for armor padding. That coat, now displayed in Vienna's Guildhall, carries an unspoken lesson. Creativity and courage are threads from the same cloth. The Tailors didn't just defend their city, they redefined what resistance could look like, proving that the skills which sustain us in peace may become the very tools that save us in war. Their last stand wasn't fought with the weapons they lacked, but with the ingenuity they'd honed over a lifetime. And in doing so, they stitched themselves into history's fabric, one desperate, defiant stitch at a time. The goldsmith's workshop had been a shrine to beauty, a place where delicate hands coaxed precious metals into filigree and gemstones caught the light like captured stars. But as Vienna's hunger grew and Ottoman cannonballs chipped away at the city's soul, this master of luxury faced an unthinkable choice. His life's work, chalices meant for royal altars, pendants commissioned for noble brides, even his own guild medal, lay piled on the anvil not to be shaped but destroyed. With trembling hands, he fed his creations into the crucible, watching years of artistry dissolve into molten streams that would harden into something brutally simple: bullets. This wasn't just pragmatism, it was alchemy of the darkest kind. The goldsmith's furnace, built to refine ore into objects of devotion, now roared with the heat of survival. Each pour of liquid gold into bullet molds felt like burying a piece of himself, a rosary bead melted down to kill, a christening spoon recast as death's currency. Witnesses later spoke of the eerie contrast: the craftsman's stained apron, his soot-streaked face, and the almost reverent care he took in crafting each projectile, as if some part of him still believed beauty could temper violence. The Ottomans, when they breached his district, found not a hoarder guarding his treasures, but a gaunt figure slumped over his workbench, surrounded by crates of golden ammunition. His tools, once used to engrave initials on wedding bands, now etched crude notches into bullet casings to ensure they'd fragment inside wounds. The irony was savage. Men who'd crossed continents for Vienna's wealth were now being shot with the very gold they'd come to plunder. Yet the true power of his stand lay beyond ballistics. In a city where class lines had dissolved into shared starvation, the goldsmith's sacrifice became a grim equalizer. His bullets, fired from the muskets of beggars and nobles alike, carried a silent message. In the crucible of siege, all value melts down to the same desperate weight. The guildsman who'd once measured worth in carats now measured it in seconds, the pause between trigger pull and Ottoman advance. the heartbeat his crafted missiles could steal from the enemy. When the relief forces finally retook the district, they found his body curled around an empty mold, his fingers stiffened in the shape of a grip still clutching phantom riches. The workshop's walls, once lined with velvet displays, bore the pockmarks of close-range gunfire, but in the ashes of his furnace, something glinted, a single unmelted medal, its inscription still legible, Ars Longa, Vita Brevis. Art endures, life is brief, a final, bitter joke from a man who'd proven the opposite, that sometimes life demands the surrender of even the most enduring beauty, and that survival, in its rawest form, is the cruelest art of all. The drums of Vienna's Stadtguard didn't just mark time, they were time. In the swirling chaos of the siege, where shouts dissolved into gunfire and smoke choked the streets, their cadence was the only constant. These weren't soldiers, they were musicians, men who'd spent their lives measuring marches for parades, not battles. Yet when the Ottomans came, they stood atop the blood-slicked ramparts, their hands blistered from days of non-stop pounding, turning rhythm into a lifeline for the city's defenders. Each beat was a command, a signal, a pulse cutting through the din. A rapid staccato meant archers to the northern wall. A deep, rolling boom signaled reserves to fill a breach. The drummer's language was universal, understood even by the Polish Hussars and German mercenaries who didn't share a word of common speech, but their position made them targets. Ottoman sharpshooters quickly learned that silencing a drummer could plunge entire sectors into disarray. And so the musicians played on, knowing every strike of their sticks painted a bullseye on their chests. The youngest of them, a boy of 14, apprenticed to the guild just months before the siege, became legend for his final act. An arrow pinned his wrist to his drum, the shaft quivering with each impact. Rather than retreat, he switched hands, his left beating a clumsy but unwavering rhythm until a second arrow found his throat. His body slumped over the drumhead, his blood staining the parchment, yet the echo of his last strike lingered, picked up by the next drummer down the line as if passing a baton. What made their stand extraordinary wasn't just the sacrifice, it was the defiance in the act of creation. Amidst the destruction, these men insisted on making something orderly, something alive. Even as their numbers dwindled, the drums never stopped. When one fell, another scrambled to take his place, sometimes a soldier with no training, hammering out a crude approximation of the cadence. The rhythm grew ragged, then adapted, evolving like a living thing. By the siege's end, the surviving drummers played with hands wrapped in torn shirts, their instruments splintered and streaked with gore, yet the heartbeat of Vienna persisted. Ottoman accounts later spoke of the unnerving effect how the drums seemed to seep into their dreams, how the relentless thump, thump, thump became a taunt, a reminder that for all their cannon and numbers, they couldn't silence this city's spirit. And when the relief forces finally arrived, their first sign Vienna still stood wasn't a flag or a cheer. It was the distant, unwavering rhythm of a single drum, beating as if to say, "We are still here. We are still counting, you have not won." Today, the Stadtguard's descendants still perform at civic ceremonies, their uniforms crisp, their drums polished to a shine. But seasoned players know the truth beneath the lacquer. The oldest instruments bear scars no restoration can erase. A hairline crack from an arrow's impact, a faint rust-colored stain near the rim. They play with that history coiled in every strike. A silent tribute to the day music became a weapon, and a drumskin proved stronger than steel. The Hofburg Palace had stood for centuries as a monument to Habsburg power, its gilded halls whispering of dynastic marriages and royal decrees, not the stench of gunpowder and unwashed desperation. But on that final, brutal afternoon of the siege, the throne room became something far more primal. a killing ground where duke and scullery maid stood shoulder to shoulder, their differences erased by the certainty of what approached. The Ottomans weren't just breaching a palace now, they were storming the heart of European royalty itself, and the defenders knew there would be no surrender, no negotiation. Only an ending. What happened next wasn't strategy, it was theater of the most tragic kind. A bishop in bloodied vestments swung a processional cross like a mace, its jeweled base caving in a janissary's skull. A teenage kitchen boy, his apron still smeared with soup stains, fired his master's ornamental pistol with shaking hands until the barrel warped from heat. Even the emperor's aged confessor joined the fray, his arthritic fingers clutching a ceremonial dagger as he whispered last rites over dying attackers and defenders alike. The throne itself became a barricade, its velvet cushions torn open to stuff gaping wounds, its golden lions spattered with brain matter and bile. The Ottomans, for all their numbers, found themselves battling not just flesh and bone, but the weight of history. Every tapestry they slashed, every portrait they defaced, seemed to unleash another surge of frenzied resistance from the defenders. A countess reportedly stabbed a soldier with her hairpin, then used his own scimitar to carve a path toward her mortally wounded husband. The palace guards, their ceremonial halberds long since shattered, fought with candelabras and broken chair legs, their uniforms reduced to scarlet rags. One witness later swore he saw a one-armed flute player from the court orchestra clubbing men with his instrument until it splintered, still humming a dissonant note from the impact. Yet amid the carnage flickered moments of surreal grace. A choir boy, his white robe now crimson, clung to the pipe organ's keyboard as arrows peppered the wood around him, playing a defiant chorale between gasps until a blade silenced him mid-measure. The music didn't stop though. Another defender took up the tune on a looted Ottoman zither, the clash of cultures creating a discordant anthem for the dying. Even the enemy seemed momentarily stunned when an elderly lady in waiting, a woman who'd spent 60 years folding napkins and arranging flowers, stepped over her butchered, made to hurl a silver-in pot at an officer's temple with lethal precision. When the last defenders fell, they did so not at the throne's feet, but on its steps, their bodies forming a gruesome stairway of tangled limbs and shattered weapons. The Ottomans, expecting to find cowering aristocrats, instead discovered something far more unsettling, a room where every social order had collapsed into pure egalitarian defiance. The siege's final irony, the throne room's greatest treasure, a gem-encrusted crown said to hold a fragment of the true cross, was found untouched beneath a pile of corpses. Not because it had been hidden, but because in those last hours, the people fighting for it had realized some symbols mattered more than survival. Their stand changed nothing tactically. Vienna would have fallen had the relief force arrived even a day later. Yet in the collective memory of a continent, the Habsburgs' final moments became alchemy, transforming base metal into myth. Because this wasn't just a last stand, it was a mirror held up to civilization itself, reflecting what happens when all pretenses of rank and privilege burn away, leaving only the raw, terrible beauty of people choosing how they'll meet the end. The Ottomans took the palace that day, but they couldn't take its lesson, that when the walls finally crumble, the only throne left is the one we build with our actions in the dust. These 25 last stands at the Siege of Vienna are more than just footnotes in a history book. They are windows into the raw, unfiltered essence of what it means to be human. Think about it, a baker wielding his peel like a halberd, a nun trading her rosary for a bandage, a clockmaker turning time itself into a weapon. These weren't mythical heroes born for glory. They were ordinary people who discovered, in the crucible of desperation, that courage isn't a trait reserved for the few. It's a choice available to anyone who refuses to let fear write their final chapter. What binds these stories together isn't just the shared backdrop of battle, it's the way they redefine what heroism looks like. The goldsmith melting his life's work into bullets, the children forming bucket brigades, the tailors stitching their own armor from wedding gowns, each act of defiance whispers the same truth: greatness isn't about strength alone. It's about creativity in the face of destruction, compassion amid chaos, and the stubborn belief that even the smallest stand can ripple through history. These men, women, and children didn't just defend a city, they proved that the human spirit is the one fortress no army can truly breach, and that's why these legends endure. They don't just belong to Vienna or 1683, they belong to all of us. Every time someone stands up to injustice, resists oppression, or protects the vulnerable, they're adding another thread to that same tapestry. The siege may have ended centuries ago, but its lessons are timeless. Heroism isn't about winning every battle. Sometimes it's simply about buying the world an extra hour, an extra breath, an extra chance to hope. So the next time you face what feels like an impossible fight, whether it's on a global stage or in the quiet corners of your own life, remember the drummers on the ramparts, the monks in the crypt, the mercenaries singing as they fell. Their stories remind us that courage is contagious, that ordinary hands can hold back the tide, and that even in the darkest hours, the choice to stand is a light no darkness can extinguish. If these tales resonate with you, share which moment moved you most in the comments below. And if you're hungry for more stories where history's underdogs defy the odds, hit subscribe, because the past is full of voices still waiting to be